Lieutenant Colonel Jyri Raitasalo is a military professor of war studies and docent of strategy and security policy at Finnish National Defense University. He previously served as a research officer, lecturer, and head lecturer at the Department of Strategic and Defense Studies at Finnish National Defense University. Jyri, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
Good to have you. The European Council recently doubled Permanent Structure Cooperation, or PESCO projects. Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron have both called for the establishment of a European army, presumably building on PESCO. How do you see NATO interacting with a European defense force? Is this a distraction from NATO? Very few NATO member states have reached their 2024 defense spending targets.
Well, there's quite a lot of things in this one question, but if we address first about the European Union side, I do think that the way that world is going as we speak, these last couple of years, Europe is facing multiple problems, and I do think that we in Europe are trying to address which would be the appropriate ways or channels to try to deal with these problems. Some of them are non-military, some of them are military. And taking this more military side or defense side to the European Union, I think it's just one way to try and figure out how should we deal with the problems. It's about resurgence of Russia. It's about the uncertainty of the US, how it's going to act here. So I can't see personally a very bright future for an army within the European Union. So I would say that this is a necessary political process that European states need in order to figure out how to deal with this today's security environment. But on the long run, I can't see that this would be too harmful for NATO. At least I see it so that most of the NATO member states, which are, by the way, European Union member states as well, can see that that NATO is the kind of hardcore defense actor, and I think it's going to stay that way. So I can say that European Union is one forum for certain kinds of military or defense-related projects, but when we're talking about hardcore defense of Europe, I can't see that European Union will in any way challenge the NATO's standing in this regard.
Is it fair to think of the EU and NATO as rivals or partners? Should they work towards greater cooperation and integration in defense and security, or should they remain fundamentally distinct and separate?
I can't see them as rivals. More than 20 member states of NATO are also member states of the European Union. So the member states have an interest in doing this in a rather smart way. There might be some bureaucrats that are working for these organizations that want to develop their own organization and maybe have some kind of rivalry or be the top actor. But the member states who are actually saying what these two organizations will do, I can't see in any way that they would start a rivalry between NATO and the European Union.
Will the common security and defense policy lead to a new and functional Treaty of Paris? And if so, what will be the effect on NATO?
Well, as I said, I don't think that within the context of Europe, we are going to see a European Union that is going to, in a way, militarize or go very deeply into the defense sector, other than something that is going to happen outside of Europe. I do think that this kind of notion of European crisis management, or however you want to call it, somewhere outside of Europe, I think the European Union is maybe one actor that might take some new roles in that. But if you're looking at hardcore defense, I can't see NATO being challenged by the current events. Whether President Trump is making threats to European Unions, European member states or not. So in this regard, I can't see a big challenge to NATO coming from the EU.
Do you see one coming from Trump? Is that realistic or is that overblown?
I think what he's saying loud and clear is something that has been said for quite a long time, and I think that the message is right. Maybe the way that it's delivered is a little bit challenging for European politicians, but I do think that Europeans need to do more, and Europe needs to do more for the security of Europe. So I do think that the message is right, but the way of delivering it might not be helpful.
NATO just held the Trident Juncture 18, its largest exercise in years. It had more than 50,000 troops, 10,000 vehicles, 30 countries, including Sweden, which, like Finland, is not a NATO member state. Was this exercise a success? What have we learned about potential conflicts in Nordic states? We did see Russia jam GPS systems.
Yeah, sorry, I missed half of the question. There was some kind of hiccup with the internet, but right at juncture, I do think that this is the process of NATO relearning do European defense against external aggression in the exercises. So I see this as a process that is going to take more than a decade for, in a way, to revitalize the Article 5 approach with the needed capabilities for the security, military security of Europe. So I do think that the Trident Juncture is a kind of signpost, one of the first concrete signposts that Europeans and NATO is taking Article 5 really seriously. In the moment, of course, from the high-level speeches, but the actual capabilities have atrophied in Europe. So what happened in Trident Juncture, I do think that it will take some time to get many of the member states that have been focusing on, with their small military forces, have been focusing on operating in a multinational environment outside of Europe, doing counterinsurgency, doing counter-terrorist operations, doing military crisis management. So this kind of the scenario of Trident Juncture is something rather new for many member states, and I do think that this is a start rather than a kind of a showing that NATO will be ready. I do think that it will actually take something like a decade before we can say credibly that the European member states of NATO and NATO as a whole is ready for these kinds of tasks on a quick notice.
The 30-30-30-30 plan would require NATO to have 30 land battalions, 30 air fighter squadrons, and 30 ships ready to deploy within 30 days of being put on alert. Is the 30-30-30-30 plan feasible?
Well, I would say that it is feasible. I'm not sure personally if that's going to be enough. I would say 30 days is quite a long time. Quite a lot of fait accompli can be achieved within 30 days. So I would say that in addition of having these kind of capabilities that can be brought on a 1 month notice, I do think that there is quite a lot of demand for much higher readiness within the sphere of defense.
What sort of time frame would you like to see?
How quick? I think this is, there's a twofold answer to this. First of all, I do think that all member states of NATO should take Article 3 seriously. And that means practically that you're taking care of your own defense in cooperation with others. So every member state, especially those that are the most vulnerable in a way vis-a-vis a military threat, I do think that they should have their own militaries beefed up quite seriously. There has been a lot of discussion about this 2% GDP on defense being some kind of measure. For many states, that is not going to be sufficient at all. But it's a good signpost on a general level. So I do think that, first of all, member states need to take care of their own defenses. And then the other part of the answer is that if this fails, then the NATO should be ready to bring in substantial forces or have them already in the vicinity of the trouble spots.
So we talked about Trump. The other wrench thrown into Europe, will Brexit affect NATO cohesion? Obviously, the UK is not looking to leave NATO, but its relationship with Europe is fraying.
I don't see it that much as a problem for NATO as it is a problem for Europe in a way. It is the same family with different kind of forums and different kind of organizations where we are organizing our cooperation. But I do see that there are many signs in Europe that things are not going that well, and it's quite a lot about societies not being very healthy. There are a lot of people in many societies in Europe that don't feel that the society and the state is for them, that they are responsible stakeholders in their own societies and in their own countries. So I do think that quite a lot of the problems that we are seeing today have a very long pedigree, years and maybe several decades, and there are not going to be quick fixes. And certainly the just getting everything right is not going to be done by being able to counter Russian information warfare. The kind of the processes that are behind these problems are quite a lot of societal nature.
2 years ago, RAND issued a report saying that NATO should deploy 7 brigades, including 3 heavy brigades, with appropriate air assets to the Baltic states in order to provide a credible deterrent to Russian hostilities. Otherwise, the capitals could be lost within 3 days. Is the situation that precarious? Are we focusing enough on planning for defensive territory?
Well, I think that the RAND study, I think that it was done by experts. So if you look at the scenario that they had, that there would be, in a way, Russian military invasion towards Baltic states, I do agree that what they are suggesting is quite correct. On the other hand, I would say that I can't foresee what is going on in Europe right now. I can't see the logic for Russia to do so. So there are, two answers to this. From the operational perspective, they're totally correct. From the strategic perspective, I would say NATO starting to deploy or pre-deploy forces to new member states on its eastern flank in this situation where we are now could actually just, make security situation worse, not better for these countries.
In the unlikely event of a Russian invasion, could a Baltic state hold out until NATO U.S. forces aided them?
Well, it's really hypothetical question. My personal take is that they would have severe problems in doing so, and also I would personally expect that the first to arrive would be U.S. troops, and then NATO troops a little bit later on, or some with some delay. But I do think that that this is one of the when I said earlier that I do think that member states of NATO should look more to the Article 3 and kind of national capabilities in addition to the alliance-wide solidarity and help to others. So I do think that this is the right recipe also for the Baltic states.
If we look at doctrine, communications, battle tactics, and geographic priorities, in the event of a Russian invasion in Eastern Europe generally, would individual national armies operate autonomously, or would we be able to achieve a decent degree of interoperability?
Well, a really hypothetical one, but I do think that whatever happens, it's going to be a surprise anyway if there is a military conflict in Europe, and I take it for granted that if something like this happens, it's going to be started mostly on a national basis. So I do think that interoperability is something that NATO has been doing for decades. Of course, the problem is that it's not been interoperability vis-a-vis high-intensity warfare. It has been interoperability of member states sending quite small contributions to counterinsurgency and other this kind of operations. So there will be some problems vis-a-vis interoperability on high-end warfighting. But as I said, it will start with a surprise, and it will start with nations starting with their own forces mostly, and then the kind of interoperability things will get into the framework a little bit later on.
2 years ago, the enhanced forward presence posture placed NATO forces in Poland and the Baltic states to deter a Crimea-like scenario there. Is the presence of Canadian, American, British, and German troops an effective deterrent? Does the EFP function as an effective tripwire?
It functions as a tripwire. If it's an effective or credible one, that's another question. I personally do think that they raise the bar for any kind of calculation about overt military aggression against the Baltic states or Poland in any way. So for me, I do think that they raise the bar quite significantly. Of course, they are token contributions, but that's the logic. The logic is that they are the tripwire that you mentioned. So I do think that I can't see any logical reason for Russia to make overt military aggression against the member state of NATO.
How do people working in logistics deal with uncertainties regarding supply routes? If there was a Ukraine 2014 or summer 1914-like event in the Baltics in which ethnic Russians protest, NATO is put on alert, and Russia uses these protests as a casus belli, would there still be access by sea a day from now, or for how long with the Suwalki corridor? How long could that be kept open? How does NATO handle logistics in such volatile situations? Who decides how and what assets are used to transfer supplies and troops into the area?
Well, I would say that quite a lot of the logistics planning and logistics preparations has been lost during the last 25 years within NATO. And I do think that the alliance and the member states are trying to relearn and take a hard look about how would these things actually would be put through in a situation of crisis. But I would like to put the question other way around. If you look at the Kaliningrad area, and you mentioned the Suwalki Gap, If I was a military commander responsible for military operations and defense of the Kaliningrad area, I would be really worried, because if you look at the kind of geographical posture or situation, location of Kaliningrad, it's an island within NATO, within NATO practically, and the sea routes open to it. It's practically an inland sea of the European Union and NATO. So you know, in a situation of a military crisis between Russia and NATO, it's not just that Russia is dominating the kind of how the conflict would evolve. I would also say that Russia has quite a lot of vulnerabilities in this area, so that it's not just so one-sided that quite often we can see or hear in much of the reporting.
Shifting from the Baltics to Ukraine, can you give us a Finnish perspective on NATO, given Russia's recent actions in Ukraine and before that Georgia? Does Ukraine demonstrate the need for NATO in 2019?
You mean for Finland?
Yes.
Well, I don't think that we have taken this kind of lesson in Finland. I think that the lesson we have taken is when we're looking at Ukraine and what has been going on there ever since 2014. I think the main lesson is that you need to have credible, good defenses. So doing military cooperation, whether that's being a member of NATO or being a partner, whatever bilateral cooperation, I think that is one part of it. But the significant part is that you must have own capabilities, because the timelines when such a crisis broke out, as we saw in Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, it's in many cases it's hours or days, and the only way to have capabilities is to have them on usable 24/7 where they are needed. So I think that the Finnish case has been ever since when the Cold War ended, that it's doing much cooperation within the Western frameworks, several defense-related frameworks, but at the same time, it's not to let go, not to drop the ball on national territorial defense. So I think that's the main lesson, and I would say we have been quite a different kind of a Western state. Finland in Europe during the post-Cold War era. We have retained this territorial focus on our defense. We have retained general conscription, quite big wartime military forces. So I do think that in a way some started to question that 5, 8, 10 years ago. I do think that after Ukraine, the discourse in Finland is totally changed, and people are happy that we did not dismantle quite a lot of this little bit old-fashioned, if you will, defense capabilities that some thought that we wouldn't be needing on the 21st century.
Since you mentioned conscription, would you recommend that as a policy for the rest of the NATO member states?
I would recommend it for some member states. I think there are several positive effects on that. First of all, it is the one that every household in Finland has a citizen soldier, or they know a citizen soldier. So we have connection across the Finnish society, and I do think that when we have about 1 million people in the reserves of the Finnish Defence Forces, we have a lot of stakeholders within the Finnish society that have an interest that the defence forces are doing okay. So that when the citizen soldiers might be needed, that they have the equipment and the training that would be needed, so that there is a chance that when they are put onto the field, that they will come back. So in a way, I think that that's kind of also a force for having a healthy defense forces. The other part is that the only way, at least from my perspective, to try to defend a country like Finland, which is quite large and is located next to Russia, which is a military great power, I do think that such a big geography, there is no way we could ever do this credibly with the professional all-volunteer force. We never could finance one. And if you look at European militaries these days, they are pretty small, and they are practically all volunteer forces. So I do think that this kind of a solution, whether it's conscription or whether it's part of the military is being conscription based, and the other part all volunteer forces, that's up to of course the different countries, but there are some positive aspects to this.
So aside from conscription and obviously spending more on defense generally, how can the West counter the hybrid warfare of Russia and Ukraine when they have some degree of plausible deniability and have never officially declared war without escalating or appearing to escalate the conflict? Can NATO do anything more to stop the advance of Russian forces in Ukraine?
Well, for me, the so-called hybrid war is mostly non-military. So I would say that much of the response that we need to make is going to be non-military or non-NATO in this regard for the member states of NATO. And for me, the first and most important point would be that long-term policies to take care of the society, so that people have a stake in that. People don't feel left outside of the society. It starts from good education. It starts from good possibilities to get a job, and if you don't get a job, then there is some kind of social security that you will make ends meet, so that you are not left behind. Because when anger starts to grow within the society, as we can see today in Paris or in Great Britain or several other European countries, in Italy, for example, when people they feel that the society and the state is not for them, then they are open prey for all kinds of influence attempts. And we have been talking quite a lot about fake news and false narratives during the last several years. I would say that most people in Europe might not actually even believe much of this fake news stuff, but they like it. It's a way to protest. It's a way to fight the establishment and show that I might not even believe this, but by liking this, by acting accordingly, I can show that I'm not pleased how my life is going in my own society. So for me, the best defense against all of these new hybrid threats would be to have a good societal and social policies that keep people on board.
So there's fake news. Another form of unorthodox warfare is Russian cyber attacks. We've seen Russian cyber attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. Is this an indicator of things to come? Will international law be adjusted to deal with this threat? Or should international law be adjusted to deal with this threat?
Well, I would say definitely cyber domain is going to be more and more important. For me, the problem is that we haven't seen cyber war in the kind of a war-like sense. We have seen that 0 times so far. So there's for me too little empirical material to make all of this guesswork about how it's going to be in the near future. So for me today, quite a lot of the agenda about cyber threats and cyber warfare is more defined by Hollywood than by actual things that have happened so far. But I totally agree with most experts that the cyber domain needs to be taken seriously when we are talking about security. And most definitely, all states are looking into it, trying to build defensive and offensive capabilities in order to influence others. So it will be important, but so far it hasn't been that important. Then you ask about this international legislation, international laws. I would say it will really take time before these norms can emerge. I do think that we are going to see some pretty nasty offensive uses of cyber weapons in the future before we can come up with these norms, unfortunately.
We have seen state-funded efforts like Stuxnet used against Iran. What would you say is the definition of a cyber war versus individual cyber attacks?
Yeah, I do recognize quite a lot of people say Stuxnet or then the Bronze Warrior thing in Estonia a decade ago. For me, warfare is violence-based, and I understand that these centrifuges were actually broken with this malware. As I understand it, the influence of Stuxnet was something like 6 months delay in the enrichment process. So it was not that significant. But for me, warfare has to do the kind of the end result, the effects of cyber war would have to be something similar to the large-scale use of violence, so which war has been. It's kind of what demarcates war from politics.
Okay. We talked a little bit about fake news. Russia seems intent on conducting psychological warfare against NATO member states, either by promoting internal agents to support the dissolution of NATO cohesion, or efforts to prevent new members like Moldova or Ukraine joining NATO. How can we counter Russia's asymmetric warfare and PSYOPs activity?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would like to say that looking at it from a kind of a general perspective, I think that trying to achieve your goals without using violence is a really smart thing to do. I think that if you have to take the force of arms to try to achieve your objectives, you will always come up with a lot of resistance, and unintended consequences which come every time when you use military force. Concerning countering Russia's actions, I would say, for me, you don't need, or you shouldn't need, to run after each fake news that comes across, whether it's the internet or whatever media it comes through. So I would say that the best way to protect yourself from this kind of threat is a long-term kind of a cohesion of the society, which is mostly a non-military task. As I mentioned earlier, it's about education more than it's about tanks, and it's more about good social policies and so on. And when we were talking about the case of Finland, also the kind of the general conscription is one part of that. Taking or giving people the responsibility that they are defending their nation in a way, so that they have a stake in its security. So I think it's a melange of things that are non-military related, and there are no quick fixes. I do think that in Europe we have a situation in many countries that it will take a decade or more to start mending the unhealthy societies where many people feel left outside.
So Ukraine is still a potential theoretical member of NATO. I'd like to look at future possible accession. In 1998, George Kennan called NATO's expansion into former Soviet territory a strategic blunder of potentially epic proportions. Is NATO accession security enhancing or limiting in 2019?
Well, it seems to me that what the situation is now, NATO expansion is not going to increase the security in Europe. So I do think that the relations between Russia and the West are so tense that the further enlargement wouldn't be a good idea in this situation. So that's my personal take on it. I can totally understand the kind of the NATO expansion starting in the late 90s. It was a totally different kind of world, and it was a totally different kind of a logic behind it. It wasn't military; it was political. And actually, when NATO enlarged on several occasions, it had no military implications. Not even defense planning, Article 5 planning, contingency planning was done based on that. So it was a totally different logic. And now there is a little bit of a surprise, or there has been a little bit of a surprise in Europe and within NATO, that Russia is actually looking at things from a rather traditional great power perspective that many thought that was gone with the fall of the Berlin Wall and end of the Cold War.
And what about expansion outside of Europe? Colombia is now a major non-NATO ally for the U.S. Could NATO expand to the South Atlantic as a viable response to Russian and Chinese support for, say, the Maduro government in Venezuela, Ortega in Nicaragua, or Diaz-Canel in Cuba?
Well, looked from my personal perspective, I can't see a logic for NATO expansion going outside of the transatlantic area broadly defined. So going into, for example, the country that you mentioned, I would say that I wouldn't be able to see this kind of a logic happening.
Another area where people have suggested NATO expand is South Asia as a way to, again, counter China and Russia. Should Asian countries be encouraged to join a NATO-like institution, NATO-like grouping located in Asia, or should the U.S. should NATO allow them to handle their defense on their own and not get distracted?
Well, I don't think that NATO has anything to do with Southeast or East Asia. I do think that the countries there have an interest in cooperating as they already do. The United States is the kind of the key coordinator and the power with the big stick. So in a way, the United States is the power that can get things moving. But I do see that regional countries over there on the Asian side have an interest in trying to deal with the security problems that they're facing related to the rise of China.
NATO has had a series of successful programs with the African Union. How can NATO interact with the AU to enhance its preparedness and protect European interests, both on the continent and outside of it, especially given security concerns vis-a-vis immigration coming out of North Africa and the Middle East?
Yeah, I do think that it's not only NATO, but it's all European states in and outside of NATO that have an interest in trying to contain these masses of people flowing in to Europe from Africa. So in a way, I would say that the most of the need for cooperation is not sending NATO troops or NATO capabilities, but it's more like providing assistance so that the African states, the African Union, can stabilize the many parts of Africa that they are having problems these days. But I can't see that that starting to deploy NATO troops or forces in operations in Africa would be the solution. If you have been looking at the failed state index or fragile state index that they publish every year, I think there is something like 60 countries in the world today that are close to being called fragile or high alert. So I think that the mass of problematic countries in the world is just too great to start intervening in them with military forces. And I do think that the history of the last 20 years tells us that when you start doing external interventions outside of your own territory, you end up in a lot of trouble.
How has the entry of former Warsaw Pact countries into NATO changed where NATO is stationing forces? Prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of forces needed to be stationed in Germany because of its borders with Warsaw Pact nations. How has adding nations like Poland changed where NATO forces base themselves? Do we need to rethink where we're basing NATO forces?
Well, I think that the basing thing has been going away from the agenda today or during the last 25 years. It hasn't been about basing. It has been mostly about getting forces out, having small forces, because the security situation hasn't been that bad or that severe. It's only during the last few years that this notion that there should be basing different member states deploying their troops or basing their troops in other countries. It's a very recent, during only a few years. So I do think that there's a lot of talk and there's a lot of willingness on the eastern flank of NATO to get other states sending their troops there, whether they are rotational or permanent. Of course, they would prefer permanent forces, but I do think that in most NATO member states there is not too much interest in sending permanent troops to the new member states of NATO. They don't want to spend the money. They don't have the troops in a way that would be credible. And the United States has so many security obligations of its own throughout the world. So I do think that it might not be reasonable to expect that the United States would start pumping a massive number of troops into Europe in the foreseeable future.
Another region not traditionally thought of as a NATO priority, the Arctic. The Arctic Ocean is more and more navigable every year. How will this affect NATO naval strategy? Is NATO preparing for Arctic conflicts? Does Finland have a unique view on this, given that Finland is currently chairing the Arctic Council?
Yeah, I think that the Finnish perspective is trying to avoid the militarization of the relations in the Arctic area. So that's a general take. But I do think that NATO is also, and it needs to prepare for contingencies in the Arctic region. I think the right juncture is one show of the latest developments in this field. There are member states, particularly in this case Denmark and especially Norway, that are driving this in a similar fashion that the new member states in the eastern flank are driving on an eastern focus. So there are many interests within NATO, and some of those are related to the Arctic area. And I would say that it's taken for granted that the NATO will need to look into and plan about the negative developments in the Arctic area as well.
Would you support having the Arctic Council act as a forum for geopolitics? Should the EU and Turkey be admitted as observer states? They've both expressed a desire to join as observers.
I think that the success of the Arctic Council is based that it is not a geopolitical forum. So I would say that we need some forums where there's possibility for dialogue, and I do think that the Arctic Council is one of those institutions. So I would leave the geopolitics out of that. I do think that we have other places to have discussions. As a general note, I would also say that it's highly problematic that we don't have too many venues for straight diplomatic talks on the high level these days with between Russia and the West. And I do think that when the conflict is ongoing and there are high tensions as there are today, this is the time for diplomacy to work, not the other way around. We shouldn't be limiting it.
To what degree do you believe climate change is a threat to NATO in terms of how it's affecting migration, disrupting trade, and of course, making the Arctic a more viable area?
I think climate change will have severe consequences for us all in all parts of the world, and some of those consequences are going to be military. So NATO will have some consequences. The migration part, maybe mostly a non-military thing, that military may be in the backseat role in this one. But I do think that that during the next 10, 20 years, what we are today calling climate change and its effects will severely also need to be taken into consideration when we're talking about defense and military operations. And this will also have something to do with NATO as well.
What do you see as the role of Turkey in NATO? They have the second largest army. They sit next to global hotspots like Syria, Ukraine, and Iraq. They also appear to be trending more Islamist and dictatorial with Erdogan. Is there a place for Turkey in NATO in 2019?
Well, there seems to be a place for Turkey in the short run, at least. But I do think that there are some big problems within the alliance with Turkey as we speak. But then again, this is not the first time in history that this is the case. But I do think that many European states are having some problems with this authoritarian style of leadership and some related policies that are related to this. So it is a problem. But I do think that it's not addressed aloud on too many occasions. I do think that that is one of the kind of the unity part of NATO. That when you have differences, you try to solve them not through media or TV cameras in front of TV cameras. You try to solve them in a diplomatic fashion.
How do you think Turkey's warmer relationships with Russia and Iran will affect NATO? Is there any sort of effective response that NATO can take to bring Turkey closer to the fold?
Yeah, I think that's it's really up. We don't know yet how much this is a kind of in a way a short-term tactical move vis-a-vis a trend that would actually mean closer ties with Russia or Iran. I think that Syria is one case where there are some shared interests, and when we are talking about security interest of states, they are prioritized. So I wouldn't say that this will automatically lead to more problems within NATO. So I would be still waiting a little bit more. But I totally agree with what you just asked, that on a short-term thing, it is a problem for NATO. But I wouldn't be still betting that there's going to be an entente between Russia, Iran, and Turkey for keeps.
The U.S. Often thinks of Turkey's position in NATO as having great importance in terms of missiles. Will the U.S. officially ending the INF treaty have a significant impact on NATO nuclear policy and positioning? Taken in concert with a nuclear posture review, is NATO reconsidering its ability to meet Russia on equal grounds in a tactical nuclear confrontation rather than relying on its traditional strategic posture to deter tactical nuclear use by Russia in Europe or elsewhere?
I would say basing intermediate range nuclear missiles in Europe would be really difficult for NATO as an organization to make decisions like that. There might be certain member states that would be willing to take those. But for NATO as a whole, I don't think I can't see that European member states would agree with this. Also, I would say that starting to make more planning for the use of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe is a little bit difficult. But on a general level, I do think that NATO will need to, and they will take nuclear deterrence more seriously also in the future, as they are looking. I would say the whole spectrum of military capabilities. What they need and what they need for deterrence purposes, and we are talking about a great power confrontation in Europe. Nuclear weapons are part of that, deterrence-wise.
Is it fair to say that we're in the midst of a new arms race, or that we're facing a new arms race, or is that overblown?
We could be in the beginning of a new arms race, but we don't know how far that will go and for how many years. But it is possible that this will develop into a new arms. Everybody is talking about these hypersonic glide vehicles and artificial intelligence and killer robots. So there are kind of many new technologies becoming available that could turn this into an arms race. And we're also witnessing some form of loss of shared norms related to the development of military technologies. So it could end up that we are today seeing the kind of first steps in a new arms race.
Okay, U.S. Department of Defense officials have called hypersonic weapons a top priority and suggested just days ago that we could have counter-hypersonic weapons by 2020. Is this realistic? How far would you say is this technology from becoming a reality?
Well, I would say, again, first, as on a general level, new technologies are always important, but in most cases, they do not revolutionize warfare. So I wouldn't be that worried. Everybody is now talking about artificial intelligence, all these hypersonic weapons. But I would say I can't see that the new technologies will bring benefits to one actor only for a very long time. So in a way, I totally understand that everybody is focusing on them now, and there's quite a lot of hype about these new weapons. But starting to develop new technologies, then procuring them, making them operational, having the organizations and training and so on, easily takes 10 years. And the other point for me would be that these days the spread of information and technologies is faster than ever in human history. So yes, there may be some technologies that China or Russia have the advantage on, but I wouldn't see that in today's world it would be feasible for them to kind of just overpower West or the US with new technologies for a very long time.
I'd like to ask you about the events of the last few days. Kosovo's parliament just voted unanimously to transform its security force into an 8,000-strong army. Serbia is planning to respond militarily. Obviously, Kosovo is not in NATO, but how dangerous is the situation? What can we do here?
I do think that Balkans there is a potential for crisis over there, and it's not only about this latest developments in Kosovo and then the formation of an army, but I think that is one of the hotspots that the West and Russia are, if not colliding, that they are having their power games over there. So in a way, I would say that the whole Balkan region today is something to watch out.
It's not just the West and Russia. There's also a breakdown in consensus between the U.S. and NATO member states. We don't seem to see eye to eye on Kosovo at all. The U.S. has suggested that we would support self-determination for the Serb minority in Kosovo. Germany is dead set against it. Does that lack of consensus threaten a unified response if there is a crisis?
Well, it could, and this is not the only case. If you look at, for example, Iran's nuclear program and responses to that, the Europeans and the US are on opposite sides in this regard as well. So it is, a little bit strange to see that there are these questions of European or global security on the table, where many European member states of NATO are closer to Russia than they are actually than they are to the US, and this is a strange situation.
So you mentioned Iran. Looking at the Middle East, is NATO prepared to face threats beyond full-scale state-to-state conflicts like Syria and Yemen? Does it have any business in getting involved in counterinsurgency, fourth-generation warfare, or humanitarian interventions? Obviously, the Finnish military has participated in missions in the Balkans and Afghanistan.
Yeah, I would say that there is not too much an appetite, at least in Europe, for counterinsurgency warfare. For the foreseeable future. I do think that the experiences that we have had from Afghanistan and Iraq, maybe also something from Libya and Syria as well, that tells that these conflicts are not going to be solved easily with the use of military force, and they are not going to be solved quickly. There could be in the future some need to do humanitarian interventions. I could see maybe this as the kind of prime logic, at least for many European member states of NATO, where they could agree that certain military operation could be started in order to prevent a large-scale humanitarian catastrophe. But I think that in that case also it would apply that the mission would be kind of boxed in so that it would not take too long a time frame to do the mission, and then there would be something like a clear strategy of how to get out. Unfortunately, there was a clear strategy of how to go out from Libya in 2011, and as we saw or have seen ever since, Libya is in chaos these days. So I do think that doing military operations on humanitarian grounds, as we saw in Libya 2011, they have backfired and are causing severe security problems for Europe for years and decades to come.
What is NATO's, or what should NATO's vision for possible future wars be based on? Should we be looking at things from an Iraq, Afghanistan, war on terror perspective, or something more conventional and tech-based?
Well, we have within NATO we have many different kinds of interests, and I do think that is one of the problems, that the NATO of almost 30 states, there is no one logic which you could base all your cooperation within the organization. For me, the lessons learned from the military operations during the last 20 years tell you that you shouldn't use your militaries too actively, because in most cases your security is going to be negatively affected with the operations rather than positively. And when I look at the three main operations during this millennium, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, I would say that in all cases the case for restraint is much more louder than the case for more operations. So for me, one of the tasks that militaries can actually do is deterrence and defense. So for me, and of course I'm coming from Finland with a certain kind of tradition in this regard as well, but for me, the kind of a very active management of new security threats globally has been a mistake, and the military should be tasked with deterrence and defense duties more in the future than they have been doing during the last 20 years.
What would you say is the biggest missed threat to the security of NATO nations today? What should we be paying more attention to?
The biggest missed threat, did you say?
Yes, the biggest threat that isn't receiving sufficient attention.
Well, that's a good question. I haven't been thinking about it in this regard, because for me, NATO is a collection of several, blocks or interest-based groups within the organization. So there are countries that are interested in territorial defense. There are countries that are interested in expeditionary warfare and counter-terrorism, counterinsurgency operations. There are states that are focusing on the Mediterranean area. Some are looking at high north in the Arctic area. So for me, it's a melange of very different kinds of interests and different kinds of strategies and logics for the use of military force. So I do think that, based on member states' interests, NATO is very kind of widely focused.
And finally, do you have any book recommendations on military science, geopolitics, and NATO, or Finland, since we have an international audience?
Yeah, well, the last two books that I read came from Stephen Walt and John Mersheimer, and they both are touching on this kind of post-Cold War era Western notions about which logics are guiding the use of security instruments and military forces. So I really like those. They are a little bit controversial maybe for many, but I do think that they have been worth reading.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.